Good morning. The 8,363rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is non-proliferation, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37, I invite the representatives of Japan and the Republic of Korea to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I am pleased to welcome the distinguished ministers and representatives gathered here this morning. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 on the agenda. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Secretary of State of the United States of America. Time and time again, over the past quarter century, the United Nations has made it clear. The world cannot accept a nuclear-armed North Korea. That's not just the United States' position, that is the world's position. Past diplomatic attempts to halt North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile development were unsuccessful. But now we're at the dawn of a new day. Since taking office, President Trump has led the international pressure campaign that has resulted in the first significant diplomatic breakthrough in decades. During President Trump and Chairman Kim's historic Singapore summit, Chairman Kim committed to work towards the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The two leaders share a common personal understanding of what must take place for the transformation of the United States DPRK relations. The United States continues to engage with North Korea to implement the commitments made in Singapore. Yesterday, I had a very positive meeting with Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho to discuss how we can move forward on all 4 commitments in the Singapore joint statement. We also discussed a second summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un. We must not forget what's brought us this far, the historic international pressure campaign that this Council has made possible through the sanctions that it imposed. Until the final denuclearization of the DPRK is achieved and fully verified, it is our solemn collective responsibility to fully implement all UN Security Council resolutions pertaining to North Korea. President Trump has made abundantly clear that if Chairman Kim follows through on his commitments, a much brighter future lies ahead for North Korea and its people, and the United States will be at the forefront of facilitating that bright future. We want to see that time come as quickly as possible, but the path to peace and a brighter future is only through diplomacy and only denuclearization. That means any other path North Korea may choose will inevitably lead to ever-increasing isolation and pressure. It is imperative for members of the United Nations to take that to heart. Enforcement of UN Security Council sanctions must continue vigorously and without fail until we realize the fully, final, verified denuclearization. The members of this Council must set the example on that effort, and we must all hold each other accountable. Particularly, we must all be accountable to enforce Resolution 2397, which lowered the annual cap on refined petroleum imports to North Korea. The United States has assessed, and we can say in no uncertain terms, that the cap of 500,000 barrels has been breached this year. We continue to see illegal imports of additional refined petroleum using ship-to-ship transfers, which are clearly prohibited under the UN resolution. As UN Security Council members, we must convey to the captains of these ships, to their owners, and anyone else involved in these transfers that we are watching them, and that they must cease their illicit activity. We must all be accountable for cutting off North Korea's illegal coal exports, which provide funds that go directly to its WMD programs. And we must be accountable, too, for curbing the number of North Korean laborers permitted within our borders. The United States is troubled by recent reports that member states, including members of the Security Council, are hosting new North Korean laborers. This violates the spirit and letter of the Security Council resolutions that we all agreed to uphold. And while sanctions remain part of the total approach we are pursuing to rid the Korean Peninsula of nuclear weapons, I want to finish on a positive note. We are well into a diplomatic process, and we hope, indeed we want, to see this through to a successful end. I'm pleased that based upon recent exchanges between President Trump and Chairman Kim, that the President has directed me to travel to Pyongyang next month to meet with Chairman Kim and to accelerate that process. I want to reiterate that the future can be very bright for North Korea if it makes good on its commitment to final, fully verified denuclearization. It will lead to the positive transformation of the U.S. DPRK relations, to greater prosperity for the North Korean people, and to an enduring peace. In our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, nations are strong, sovereign, connected, prosperous, and at peace. But that vision for the region will never be complete if we fail to bring about this transformation on the Korean Peninsula. The Korean people, the region, and the world will never realize the full promise of the future if we do not seize this unprecedented diplomatic opening for peace. I said at the beginning of my statement that we are at the dawn of a new day in the world's relationship with North Korea. We do not yet know what that day will bring, but we are hopeful that the current breakthrough in diplomacy will yield a brighter future for North Korea and a safer world for all of us. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussions. I give the floor now to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kuwait.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, it gives me great pleasure to express Kuwait's appreciation for the efforts of the United States and its permanent mission during its presidency of the Security Council this month of September. I'm also pleased to see Your Excellency in this chamber for the first time since you took office as Secretary of State, and I appreciate your comprehensive and enriching briefing just presented. Today's meeting on non-proliferation issues and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea comes only 24 hours after convening the Security, where the threats posed by weapons of mass destruction were discussed by heads of states and governments. These important meetings, in conjunction with many other sessions held by the Council this year, are a clear indication of the grave danger posed by the threat of nuclear proliferation and weapons of mass destruction, as well as the importance the Security Council places on addressing this danger to humanity in line with its responsibility for conflict prevention and the maintenance of international peace and security. Mr. President, the situation on the Korean Peninsula is one of the longest-running issues on the United Nations agenda, as well as one of the most serious. A few months ago, we all followed with great concern the rising tensions on the Korean Peninsula, exacerbated by the danger of military escalation in the region following the launch of nuclear tests and ballistic missiles by North Korea in clear violation of relevant Security Council resolutions. But the strong and sincere political will shown by the United States and states in the region to choose the path of direct dialogue resulted in the convening of 3 presidential summits in a period of just 4 months, in addition to the understandings that they resulted in. These summits led to a number of commitments which were supported by the state of Kuwait and the international community, and those commitments contributed to diffusing the threat of a military confrontation and to de-escalating tensions in the Korean Peninsula with the aim of achieving the desired goal of denuclearization and the establishment of a comprehensive and lasting peace between the 2 Koreas. It is also important to emphasize the key role of the Security Council in launching these diplomatic talks. Indeed, the cohesion and unity of Council members in condemning all North Korea's illegal programs and activities and in adopting a series of international resolutions imposing the broadest and most comprehensive sanctions in the history of the United Nations. This cohesion and unity was central to the decision to start negotiations, as had long been called for by relevant Security Council resolutions. Mr. President, since the beginning of our membership in the Council, the State of Kuwait has worked relentlessly to implement all the priorities we declared during our election campaign. These priorities are at the core of our foreign policy, which is founded on the basic principles of international law, on promoting the role of preventive diplomacy, and redoubling efforts to prevent and resolve conflicts peacefully. Based on this, the State of Kuwait believes that the way to deal with this issue being discussed at this ministerial session of the Security Council is through showing full support for the direct talks to reach a peaceful solution to the crisis of North Korea's nuclear program and to establish a sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula. At the same time, we emphasize the need for North Korea to fully comply with all its international obligations in accordance with relevant Security Council resolutions, including the elimination of its nuclear weapons and illicit programs, and rejoining the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear state. The State of Kuwait also stresses the importance of holding these direct talks in parallel and conjunction with the full implementation of relevant Security Council resolutions by United Nations member states, which will provide support for the current course of negotiations. The full commitment to the implementation of Security Council resolutions and the resolution of issues through dialogue and negotiations is the wisest choice and only solution for all parties to resolve this issue. Before concluding, I would like to emphasize that non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction is only guaranteed through their destruction and total elimination. I recall here the first resolution adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations, that is resolution number 1 of the 24th of January 1946, which was adopted by consensus and aimed at eliminating all nuclear weapons. The commitment to achieve consensus, to put an end to the grave threats posed by such weapons, confirms our conviction that the continued unity of Security Council members is the most important element for nuclear disarmament on the Korean Peninsula. The State of Kuwait will remain committed and keen to supporting dialogue and negotiations so that we can eliminate all nuclear weapons and, in doing so, fully implement this very first United Nations resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Minister for his statement. And I'll give the floor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China.
Mr. President, in the course of this year, we've seen important positive developments on the Korean Peninsula. Things have again returned to the track of dialogue and negotiation. The DPRK and the ROK, seizing the opportunity of the Pyeongchang winter, together made a first step across the military demarcation line. And last week, again, we heard good news. The DPRK and the ROK had their third summit this year and released a Pyongyang joint declaration. The two Koreas have thus achieved an all-round improvement of relations and jointly undertaken to turn the peninsula into a peaceful place free of nuclear weapons and nuclear threat. China applauds the political decisiveness and courage demonstrated by the two leaders. China firmly supports the two countries in turning their leaders' consensus into concrete actions, in building mutual trust, and in advancing reconciliation and cooperation on the peninsula. In their historic summit in Singapore this June, the DPRK and the United States reached important common understandings on comprehensive denuclearization and the building of a peace mechanism on the peninsula. This serves the shared interests of all parties, including the US and the DPRK, and meets the need of regional peace and stability. It is also what the international community hopes to see. The DPRK and the US are in active preparations for their second summit. China supports the US and the DPRK in keeping the dialogue going, in meeting each other halfway, and in working for more deliverables from this meeting. Mr. President, China's position on the peninsula issue is consistent. China is committed to denuclearization, to peace and stability on the peninsula, and to resolving issues through dialogue and consultation. China has put in great efforts and energy in this cause. The recent positive developments on the peninsula are exactly what China has been working for over the years. At this juncture, the Security Council has a duty and need to send a united and clear message to support and encourage all parties to accelerate the process of political settlement. All parties need to work together for a peaceful and stable peninsula. This is an aspiration shared by the DPRK, the RK, and all other countries in the region. The peninsula issue is essentially about security. To realize peace on the peninsula, the key is to address the legitimate security concerns of all parties in an appropriate and balanced manner. The DPRK have suspended its nuclear and missile tests and gradually dismantled some facilities, and the US and the RK on their part have suspended military exercises. Building on that, a timely release of an end-of-war declaration would dispel the specter of war on the peninsula and articulate the political will of having no more war. It will help build basic trust. It will further facilitate denuclearization and put in place the conditions needed for the final peace accord. So in China's view, a political and wise decision must be made. All parties need to work together for a completely denuclearized peninsula. Denuclearization is a prerequisite for lasting peace on the peninsula. It is what we must do to uphold the nuclear non-proliferation regime, and it represents the shared objective of concerted global efforts. China believes that the most effective way to denuclearization is for it to be advanced in parallel with the building of a peace mechanism on the peninsula, so that the two can support and reinforce each other and be settled together. The main players in this process are the DPRK and the US, but all stakeholders are obligated to make their respective efforts. The six-party talks has played an important role. It will remain an indispensable multilateral platform. The Security Council should also form consensus in a timely manner to facilitate and support this process. All parties need to work together for a peninsula of mutually beneficial cooperation. The denuclearization is ultimately aimed at bringing to the people on the peninsula and in the region a better life of greater prosperity, peace, and happiness. The past few decades, cooperation around the peninsula has stalled due to various disruptions, but this year the DPRK has made a major decision to shift its focus to economic development. We believe this decision deserves welcome and support from the international community as denuclearization moves forward. As long as Security Council resolutions are continued to be enforced, all parties can gradually carry out, where conditions are right, practical cooperation to improve people's well-being. We hope that the day when denuclearization is achieved is also when rejuvenation comes to the peninsula. The Security Council, within its mandate enshrined in the UN Charter, has adopted several resolutions related to the DPRK. As long as these resolutions remain valid, they must continue to be implemented fully and accurately in their entirety. China firmly believes that pressure is not the end. Both implementing sanctions and promoting political settlement are equally important under Security Council resolutions. They must be advanced in parallel not in a partial or selective way. There is a provision in the Security Council resolutions that the Council is prepared to modify the sanction measures in light of the DPRK's compliance. Now, given the positive developments in the inter-Korean and the DPRK-US relations, and the DPRK's important pledges and actions on denuclearization, China believes that the Security Council needs to consider invoking in due course this provision to encourage the DPRK and other relevant parties to move denuclearization further ahead. This year marks the 65th anniversary of the Korean War Armistice Agreement. To realize complete denuclearization and build a peace mechanism on the peninsula is China's consistent proposition and a shared international consensus. China calls on all parties to demonstrate political courage, advance dialogue and negotiation, and together work for durable peace. China will continue to contribute to this objective. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Minister for his statement. I give the floor to the Secretary for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. In March 1963, President Kennedy predicted that as many as 25 nations would soon develop nuclear weapons, posing what he described as the greatest possible danger to the survival of humanity. In the event, his bleak prophecy never came to pass. 7 years after Kennedy voiced his fears, the world summoned the collective wisdom to create the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which now has 191 states parties. All but a handful of countries put aside their differences and agreed that global security, indeed the existence of the human race, depended on halting the spread of nuclear weapons. Only one country signed the NPT and then sought to withdraw from it. Only one country promised in this treaty never to develop nuclear weapons and then did exactly that. And that country is North Korea, which has tested 6 nuclear devices in the last 12 years. Today, the international community shares a collective responsibility to ensure that North Korea complies once again with the rules on which the safety of every nation depends. Britain welcomes North Korea's decision to re-engage in diplomacy since the beginning of this year. We're encouraged by the meeting between President Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang last week. We hope that North Korea's repeated promises to denuclearize are genuine. But we note the lack of concrete steps so far. Action counts for more than assurances. Deeds must follow words. North Korea must comprehensively, verifiably, and irreversibly abandon its nuclear weapons and the means to build them, in accordance with the resolutions passed by this Council. Till that moment comes, Britain believes that the sanctions agreed by the international community should continue to be rigorously enforced, reflecting our shared belief that North Korea's nuclear ambitions threaten the safety of all our peoples. This Council passed the relevant resolutions as one, and we should enforce them as one, until the conditions that caused their adoption have decisively and irrevocably changed. Britain will continue to play our part in this effort. We're supporting the work of the Sanctions Committee established by Resolution 1718 and the UN panel of experts. The onus rests on the whole Council to prevent North Korea from evading sanctions, particularly the controls on refined petroleum products. We support the assessment presented by Secretary Pompeo and the United States, which demonstrates that North Korea has systematically violated the control. Britain sent 2 Royal Navy ships, HMS Sutherland and HMS Albion, to the Pacific, where they've helped to monitor illegal fuel transfers. A 3rd ship, HMS Argyll, is due in East Asia later this year. The members of this Council, especially the 5 permanent members, have a duty to uphold and enforce the sanctions contained in the resolutions which we ourselves supported. We mustn't allow the authority of the Security Council to be undermined. Today, North Korea's leadership has a choice to make. in a country where 200,000 children are acutely malnourished, half of all schools have no access to running water, and only 3% of roads are paved, the regime has squandered the nation's resources and deepened the poverty of its people by pursuing an illegal stop. Arsenal has only increased tensions in East Asia and brought upon North Korea the most extensive economic sanctions ever imposed by this council in the 21st. North and South Korea had about the same GDP per capita. Since then, decades of communist economic failure in North Korea have opened up a 20-fold disparity. Today, North Korea's GDP per capita is less than 5% of South Korea's. But it is not too late to change course. Just as President Kennedy's prediction turned out to be pessimistic, there's nothing inevitable about the road along which North Korea has so far traveled. Before his regime wastes even more resources, creates yet more poverty, and triggers still greater confrontations, Kim Jong-un could decide to allow his country to flourish in peace and safety. He could choose to heed the will of this council, keep his own promises, and relinquish the nuclear arsenal that has brought only misery and tension. The decision rests on his shoulders. Until then, this council should hold fast to the resolutions we've passed. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary for his statement. I give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for organizing this meeting on the DPRK, a subject at the top of our agenda. It's an issue of vital importance to peace and security in the region and to the world at large. We've come a long way in the past year in the region and to the world at large. We've come a long way in the past year. As Henry Ford once said, coming together is the beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is strength. The Council has worked hard to optimize its strength by striking the right balance between the two main ingredients, pressure and dialogue. And I think it's safe to say that we've succeeded, thanks to our unity, a vital component that should never be underestimated. Our show of unity was, of course, brought about by the gravity of last year's events. DPRK's multiple ballistic missile tests and nuclear tests, and its development of a nuclear and missile program that posed a threat to regional and global security, as well as the global non-proliferation region. It gave us a shared sense of purpose and highlighted the urgent need to bring the DPRK back to the negotiating table. In response, this Council has worked together tirelessly and with clear results. It adopted 3 far-reaching resolutions within the space of 5 months, resulting in the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever. This forced Pyongyang to back to the negotiating table and created a window of diplomatic opportunity that exists today. The Republic of Korea and the US seized this opportunity in 2018 by organizing high-level talks. President Moon, President Trump, and you, Secretary Pompeo, rose to the occasion, and we are grateful for that. The international community should maintain the pressure until the DPRK meets its international obligations. We should never underestimate the power a united Council can wield. A united Council will keep up the pressure on the DPRK. A united Council will ensure full and effective implementation of sanctions and pave the way for complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And the United Council will support diplomatic talks and reassure the DPRK that we are willing to engage with it once it has taken concrete steps towards denuclearization. And to achieve this, a well-functioning 1718 Sanctions Committee is essential. It can play a key role in taking action against sanction violations and in minimizing the humanitarian impact. As the chair of the committee, the Kingdom of the Netherlands will continue to do its utmost to this end. We need a panel of experts that can do its job in an effective, independent, and secure manner. And last but not least, we need to be persistent. It won't be easy, but no effort should be spared in seeking a peaceful solution. There's simply too much at stake. The DPRK continues to evade sanctions in order to advance its nuclear weapon program, often with the, possibly unwitting, assistance of its nuclear weapon program, often with the, possibly unwitting, assistance of other countries. The DPRK might still be moving towards a deployable nuclear intercontinental ballistic missile. There's still a risk of the further spread of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction and delivery system technology. And this would further undermine the global non-proliferation regime. In closing, let me say this. Failure is not an option. Failure benefits no one. If we act in unison and fully implement this Council's resolution, Mr. President.
I thank the Minister for his statements. I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank the U.S. Presidency for organizing this ministerial meeting on an issue which has serious implications for regional and international peace and security. A year ago, I chaired a meeting of the Security Council during the Ethiopian presidency when we discussed the DPRK issue. We all recall the tense situation that was prevailing in the Korean Peninsula. Since then, we have come a long way in de-escalating the situation. Determination and diplomacy, coupled with our united measures at the Security Council, have led to 3 summit-level meetings between the Republic of Korea and the DPRK, as well as between the United States and the DPRK. More importantly, it has resulted in the Punjamun Declaration and the Pyongyang Joint Declaration. The latest commitment of the DPRK to the dismantlement of a missile engine test site and launch platform, as well as the permanent dismantlement of the nuclear facilities in Yongbyon in the presence of experts, as reflected in the Pyongyang Joint Declaration, is indeed a step in the right direction. The important steps taken by the Republic of Korea and the DPRK at the Pyongyang summit, particularly military confidence-building measures and agreement to reduce military tensions along the two sides' heavily militarized border, will also have significant contribution to reducing tension and avoiding any miscalculations in the Korean Peninsula. We hope these commitments and steps will lay the basis for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the advancement of peace in the Northeast Asia. Mr. President, finding a comprehensive, peaceful, political and diplomatic solution to this long-standing issue and ensuring the complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula requires continued dialogue. It is in the context of that we welcome, Mr. President, your readiness to travel to Pyongyang to continue dialogue and possibly make more progress on the issue. In the meantime, we recognize the importance of ensuring full compliance with the relevant Security Council resolution on the DPRK. We note implementation gaps in the relation to the sanctions imposed by the Council. This requires the continued cooperation of member states, and I would like to reaffirm the commitment of Ethiopia to fully implement the relevant Council resolutions. Overall, the recent developments we have all been observing in the community. That is why we support the call made by the Secretary General last week in this regard. The parties should be encouraged to keep the momentum in their endeavors towards sustainable peace, security, and complete and verifiable denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula in accordance with relevant Security Council resolutions. Finally, Mr. President, preserving the unity of this Council also remains absolutely important, and we hope we will continue to do so in facilitating the search for a comprehensive diplomatic solution of the DPRK issue with the ultimate objective of achieving the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister very much for his statement. I give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank Secretary of State Mike Pompeo for his briefing on efforts to denuclearize the DPRK. Poland highly appreciates this timely debate as well as the transparency and openness in which this weighty subject is approached. A few months ago, we were all pleased to hear that one of the most complicated problems of nuclear proliferation affecting regional and international security could be resolved peacefully thanks to goodwill, spirit of cooperation, and common interests. We all agree that long-lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula can only be achieved through peaceful means. Therefore, we welcome the continued progress in inter-Korean dialogue. We are glad to note that the third summit organized this year between the leaders of the DPRK and the Republic of Korea, which took place a few days ago, was another important step in invigorating and maintaining dialogue on the peninsula. We also welcome the diplomatic process related to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, marked by the historic summit in Singapore earlier this year. We hope that further steps in this regard would be made following the intensive contacts between the United States and the DPRK. In this context, we all have welcomed the announcement by the DPRK on the suspension of nuclear as well as intercontinental ballistic missile tests. Another step in this right direction was destroying a nuclear weapons test site in Pyongyang. Nonetheless, it is yet to be seen if this trend continues in the future. It is now crucial to maintain the momentum, the window of opportunity, and move forward on the path to de-escalation. Denuclearization of the DPRK must remain a top priority for the entire international community. Despite positive developments, Pyongyang's nuclear and missile programs still pose a threat to international security and stability of the region. We are also deeply concerned about the risk generated by potential proliferation of sensitive goods and technology to other states and non-state actors. Pyongyang continues to defy the Security Council resolutions in an increasingly sophisticated manner. We reiterate our position that despite political and legal difficulties, it is mandatory for all states, without exception, to comply with obligations arising from the respective Security Council resolutions. We are well aware that lasting peace will not be achieved without a complete and irreversible denuclearization of the DPRK in compliance with the United Nations Security Council resolutions. This process has not started yet. Consistent pressure on the DPRK. We call on other Security Council members to show our collective intent to implement sanctions fully, stop the DPRK's efforts aimed at circumventing the UN sanctions and prevent other member states from undermining these sanctions. Council members should recommit to implementing all the existing and future sanctions to maximize pressure on the DPRK to take immediate, meaningful steps towards denuclearization. The process made so far was possible thanks to the common actions taken by all states in unison. We hope the same spirit of cooperation and unanimity will characterize future activities in this area. Positive developments will have profound implications and beneficial consequences for international relations, including enhanced credibility and reliability of the international weapons of mass destruction non-proliferation regimes. In this regard, as a sole sponsor of the United Nations General Assembly resolution on implementation of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling and Use of Chemical Weapons and on their destruction, we would like to express our hope that the DPRK will adhere to this treaty soon, filling the gap in its almost achieved universalization. Another crucial step towards de-escalation and confidence building would be Pyongyang's signing the comprehensive treaty. Let me remind you how effective this treaty was, even not yet in force, for our dealing with the DPRK's nuclear tests. Dear colleagues, as a member of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, Poland has been actively supporting international efforts to promote peace and stability in the region. We will continue to engage in all activities that would lead to permanent denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This also means supporting further initiatives and actions aimed at reducing tension and facilitating dialogue. Poland will continue its engagement in the international bodies as well as in other global and regional initiatives. The examples of our engagement in this regard include our recent chairmanship of the Preparatory Committee for the 2020 Review Conference on the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and the Hague Code of Conduct Against Ballistic Missile Proliferation, as well as ongoing international partnership for nuclear disarmament verification. To conclude, let me express our deep belief that the current momentum will not be wasted. The list of activities is long. North Korean denuclearization, strengthening the universalization of the non-proliferation regimes, securing the verification mechanisms, implementation of good practices, as well as tightening international cooperation in the field. If we want to be successful, we must stand united.
I thank the Minister for his statement. I give the floor now to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, colleagues, over the past few months, significant progress has been achieved in resolving the problems of the Korean Peninsula. The region has seen significant reduction in tension as a result of the moratorium declared in Pyongyang in April on launches of missiles and nuclear tests and closing of the test site in Pyongyang, and the decision by the United States and the Republic of Korea to postpone indefinitely their military maneuvers. We note the successful implementation of the inter-Korean agreements enshrined in the Panmunjom Declaration from the 27th of April and the September visit to the DPRK of the President of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, during which visit the Pyongyang Declaration was signed. That declaration sets out intention to increase multifaceted cooperation and also the obligation undertaken to dismantle the missile range in Tonchani and the closure of nuclear facilities in Anben, which gives us hope for stabilization of the situation in this part of the world. Russia has actively supported the rapprochement between South and North Korea and the resolution of the problems of the Korean Peninsula overall. We have been calling on partners for a long time toward this, including as part of the implementation of the roadmap that was adopted last summer by Russia and China, and which is de facto being implemented now. We're convinced that building trust is the key to resolving the problems on the Korean Peninsula through political and diplomatic means. The agreement reached in Pyongyang between North and South on reestablishing rail and road connections is a very important step in this direction. We call on members of the Security Council to support the initiative of Pyongyang and Seoul, which fully responds to the spirit of the decisions we have adopted. It is unacceptable that for sanctions against the DPRK to become an instrument of collective punishment. The lack of trust between Washington and Pyongyang hinders the development of joint measures which the parties could take at the same time and sequentially to move the process of resolving outstanding differences forward. We should think about the system of international guarantees, which could play a decisive role in resolving the problem of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Against the backdrop of the readiness demonstrated by Pyongyang to cooperate and the progress in stabilizing the situation in the region, it seems inappropriate and untimely when our Western partners have imposed a course towards tightening the sanctions regime against DPRK. Given that Pyongyang has taken important steps towards denuclearization, it would seem that it would be logical to support this momentum, to strengthen this momentum. In this connection, I would like to hear an explanation for the reasons of why some of our colleagues in the Security Council have stubbornly ruled out the possibility of any positive signal from the Security Council regarding the steps taken by Pyongyang towards denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. I would just like to remind you that any negotiations are a two-way street. Steps by the DPRK towards gradual disarmament should be followed by easing of sanctions. There should be reaction towards every action. This is necessary to avoid a situation which, for example, occurred with respect to the JCPOA, where our American colleagues, based on bogus pretexts, withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal unilaterally and thus violated their obligations in the framework of the Security Council. Institutions and mechanisms of the United Nations and its Security Council must be used to support the process of resolving the inter-Korean dialogue rather than becoming a hindrance. Only then can we speak about effectively resolving the problems that have accumulated in the region, including the nuclear one, based on dialogue and mutually acceptable agreements. It would be difficult to achieve this through sanctions and pressure. Now, the excessive use of the sanctions instruments of the Security Council have already become the reason why member states and international organizations often cannot normally maintain even humanitarian, diplomatic, and sporting ties with the DPRK, which have nothing to do with the development of nuclear and missile programs. A further increase of sanctions goes beyond cutting off financing of banned missile and nuclear programs on Pyongyang, and in fact is a threat to North Korean citizens and will bring extreme socioeconomic and humanitarian sufferings. It's important to recall that all resolutions of the Security Council on DPRK contain not only a sanctions component, but provisions on measures to achieve a political and diplomatic solution to the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Disregarding these provisions amounts to not complying with the consensus agreements of the Security Council on the DPRK. Even more unacceptable are autonomous or secondary sanctions against DPRK or other states which have been introduced by the United States and some of their allies. In addition, and going around the Security Council, such unilateral restrictions not only undermine the sovereignty and the legitimate interests of member states and run counter to international norms of trade, but overall undermine the integrity of the restrictions agreed within the Security Council. Once again, we call on countries that introduce such sanctions to refrain from this practice. We note that increasingly these restrictions have become an instrument of unfair competition and intimidating economic agents from third countries. The example of DPR banned due to these illicit practices and the fear of entrepreneurs to find themselves on these punitive lists. It's unacceptable such attempts to cover these restrictions under the authority of the Security Council or under the 1718 Committee, and using the committee to undermine or to suggest that some countries are not complying with their obligations. We're strongly in favor of having the Security Council and the 1718 Committee to contribute as much as possible to finding the political and diplomatic solutions to the problems of the Korean Peninsula and creating a mechanism for security in northeastern Asia. We think it's very timely for the Security Council to send a clear signal in support of the positive momentum of the situation around the Korean Peninsula. This could be done, for example, by adopting a relevant resolution. And we want to prepare a draft of such a resolution and propose it to the Security Council to consider it. We also believe it's very important to regularly discuss whether it's advisable to review certain various restrictions against DPRK as it moves towards giving up its nuclear weapons. For example, we might think about some modest steps. The resolutions of the Security Council do allow for a review of restrictions in cases where there's progress on the political track. In the Panmunjom and the Pyongyang declarations, as I said, confirm the interests of both parties to implement joint economic projects. Well, if we welcome these agreements, let's think of possibly creating within the 1718 committee specific conditions for considering applications for exemptions from the sanctions regime to carry out projects of inter-Korean cooperation on which Pyongyang and Seoul have agreed to. Russia is ready to very closely cooperate with all interested parties in the interest of ensuring peace, stability, and comprehensive resolution of the problems of the Korean Peninsula based on equal, non-discriminatory negotiations with the participation of all interested parties. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the Minister for his statement. I give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of France.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President. My dear colleagues, North Korea continues to represent the greatest proliferation crisis that the international community has had to face at the beginning of the 21st century. It is a major challenge for our collective security, and I'd like to thank the Secretary of State, Mr. Mike Pompeo, for organizing this event. What is the situation? Well, the processes undertaken between North and South Korea on the one hand and between the United States and North Korea on the other have made it possible to reduce tensions on the Korean Peninsula since the beginning of 2018. The Singapore summit in this regard was an important event held at the initiative of the United States, and of course we should welcome this. In the light, in particular, of the defiance that had been demonstrated throughout 2017. We have taken note of the commitments taken by North Korea in the Pyongyang Declaration of the 19th of September, which tend towards easing tensions and to bring about a rapprochement between the two Koreas. And I welcome here the diplomatic efforts of President Moon, shown once again during the Inter-Korean summit held last week. However, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that until North Korea has abandoned its nuclear and ballistic programs, these programs will continue to represent a threat for the region and for the world. And the priority of our Council must be to bring North Korea to show a significant willingness to renounce its ambition, to equip itself with an operational nuclear arsenal, and to take tangible measures in this regard. Indeed, the International Atomic Energy Agency recently pointed out that North Korea has, in recent months, pursued nuclear activities, and the United Nations panel of experts has also restated this. We must also stress that North Korea has not ratified the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and maintains military capacity in the area of chemical and biological weapons. The investigation into the death of Kim Jong-nam in February of 2017 in Kuala Lumpur established links with North Korea. Because of this, and despite a reduction in tensions that we should welcome, there is still a threat to international peace and security. And as long as the North Korean ballistic and nuclear programs remain in existence, any event is capable of creating an escalation. And as long as the programs are continuing, there is still a risk of secondary proliferation from North Korea towards other countries or even non-state actors, until the North Korean arsenal has been eliminated and until its nuclear experts have not been reconverted to civilian sectors. The threat remains. The mission of this Council must be to keep up the pressure so that this time North Korea does keep its commitments And in order for the process that's been begun to bear fruit, it must be based on concrete gestures. There must be genuine willingness to dismantle the nuclear and ballistic programs in a complete, verifiable and irreversible manner in accordance with Security Council resolutions. We expect North Korea to go beyond a number of symbolic, and it's true, but also reversible gestures, such as the announcement of a destruction of its nuclear test site. The International Atomic Energy Agency will, in this regard, certainly have an important role to play, and it's preparing actively for this. And the experts from the states involved will need to verify the most sensitive activities, and France is prepared to provide its help at the appropriate time. A first specific step could be to draw up a complete and accurate inventory of the nuclear and ballistic program of North Korea. So what attitude should we adopt? Well, first of all, we should support the exacting dialogue. This is very important to re-establish trust in order to progress on the path of denuclearization. And at the same time, collectively, we should maintain our policy of being firm with regard to North Korea and by rigorously applying the sanctions decided upon by the Security Council. Sanctions are not an end in themselves, but they are a strategy to apply pressure in order to bring about a political solution. The Security Council, I think, on this point should remain unified. The sanctions remain essential, and we are particularly vigilant with regard to everyone respecting their obligations under international law. And I welcome here the remarkable work that has been done by the panel of experts and the Sanctions Committee of the United Nations, which are essential tools for checking the effective implementation of UN sanctions. And I'd like to stress how much we attach importance to the independence and impartiality of the work of the panel of experts. And also, and this has been said by several previous speakers, we must fight against the strategies deployed by North Korea to circumvent the sanctions through various illicit activities such as money laundering and ship-to-ship transfers of oil and coal. President Kim Jong-un says that he wants denuclearization, and he asks us not to doubt his intentions. Well, we, for our part, will judge him by his actions, and we urge a united and determined response of the international community, respecting the decisions of this Council. The credibility and the durability of our collective security architecture, and in particular the durability of non-proliferation, are what are at stake. That is the path that France would like to see us follow here in this Council.
I thank the Minister for his statement. I give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan.
Thank you. We are grateful to the U.S. Presidency and to you, Secretary Pompeo, personally, for this opportunity to envision further steps to achieve the complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Kazakhstan knows firsthand that nuclear disarmament is a complex and comprehensive process which demands a step-by-step approach with incredible efforts, immense patience, mutual concessions, and good faith on behalf of all stakeholders. That is why Kazakhstan invites the leadership of DPRK to follow a successful experience and a bright path of Kazakhstan. And I hope that our dialogue with my distinguished colleague from the North Korea is very meaningful. As you know, despite the great temptation to become a new nuclear power upon our independence in 1991, and the unpredictable geopolitical uncertainties in the region at that time, my President Nursultan Nazarbayev made the momentous decision to abandon the fourth largest nuclear arsenal in the world we inherited and shut down the world's second largest Semipalatinsk nuclear test site. We successfully steered through an uncharted way and eventually became a trusted and reliable partner for the world community, which in turn invested in us resulting in numerous economic gains for the nation and our people. Today, Kazakhstan is a progressive, stable, and prosperous state with the ambitious goal to become one of the 30 most advanced economies and countries in the world in the coming decades. Our robust steps to achieve nuclear denuclearization were a testament of strong political will, were undertaken successfully thanks to the exemplary cooperative efforts of the Russian Federation and the United States. I believe that such practical, pragmatic, and mutually beneficial collaboration could be used in other new circumstances for tackling new threats emerging in our contemporary world. We are also deeply grateful to the United Kingdom, France, and China for their constructive support for our anti-nuclear endeavors. It is indeed very remarkable that all 5 nuclear powers simultaneously signed the protocol to the Central Asian Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty, so-called Semipalatinsk Treaty. It is a good example of mutual goodwill, despite the differences among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which indicates that there can be further joint efforts on important issues aimed at strengthening non-proliferation. Our invaluable experience says that disarmament is the best measure to build confidence. Having chosen a nuclear-free path, we went further together with our 4 neighboring fraternal countries to create a nuclear weapon-free zone in Central Asia. It is still the first and only one of its kind in the northern hemisphere of the planet, flanked by 2 large nuclear powers and in the vicinity of some other actors. Furthermore, President Nazarbayev initiated the most important project to create in Asia a wide expanse of trustful and trustworthy cooperation. So, in 1992, we established the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia, CICA, which now unites 27 states of the region and acts successfully to avert threats. This is a unique regional structure where Iran and Israel, India and Pakistan, and other states with complex relations sitting at one table side by side, negotiate measures of mutual respect and goodwill. We thus welcome the DPRK and Japan to become members of CICA, that we can embrace Northeast Asia into our fold and provide a new groundwork of solidarity and trust. My President's experience and further ideas on CBMs have been shared with the Council in January this year at the signature event of Kazakhstan's presidency. Today's developments in the Korean Peninsula are demonstrating the relevance of this approach. We commend the 2 Korean states for their meaningful efforts and joint projects to restore an inclusive dialogue. We also highly appreciate the decision of the United States and the Republic of Korea to suspend their joint regional and regular military exercises. All these are encouraging the parties to continue peaceful political diplomatic measures that made possible the historic Singapore summit, as well as the continuation of inter-Korean summits. We highly support such endeavors and welcome the outcomes of the 3rd meeting of the 2 Korean leaders with further important agreements contained in the Pyongyang Joint Declaration. The continued friendly political dialogue and mutual beneficial projects between Pyongyang and Seoul has a potential to become the most effective way for long-term settlement of tensions in the region, resulting in mutually acceptable solutions for full, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. How the Security Council can better contribute to this noble cause? First of all, the unity of the Council must be preserved and harnessed to achieve this key overarching task. We hope that there will be a speedy settlement for some of the remaining disagreements among the members of the Council on the basis of mutual trust and endurance. Kazakhstan understands the serious concerns regarding the continued violation of UNSC resolutions and related sanctions requirements from the DPRK and others. It has to be realized that our constructive actions are based on good intentions, with the understanding that sanctions are interim measures designed to solve problematic issues by peaceful and political diplomatic means. Based on its practical experience, Kazakhstan advocates for transparency and gradual process in the massive disarmament undertaking, which must give equal consideration to the concerns of all parties and the mutual realization of the commitments pledged. My President noted during the January meeting that providing security assurances to the disarming party is an important sine qua non for moving forward. Mr. President, in this specific context, Kazakhstan suggests considering the possibility of developing a roadmap for the phased denuclearization of North Korea with solid security guarantees from the P5. Instead, full implementation by the DPRK of all its obligations and return to the NPT. The compulsory implementation of this course of action could be enshrined in a relevant resolution of the Council with clear consequences if not fulfilled. Kazakhstan is ready to share its experience and to provide technical expertise to realize a phased and transparent process of denuclearization. We are confident that DPRK will be able to replicate our success and go even beyond by its practical example to inspire the Northeast Asian region to become the second nuclear weapons-free zone in the Northern Hemisphere. Such zones should be necessarily encouraged by obtaining security guarantees from the P5. In this regard, we reiterate our hope that Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone will be endorsed by the last remaining country of P5. Finally, Mr. President, the situation on the Korean Peninsula today is much improved and more favorable than ever before. It prompts us to focus more, to work with determination, and to redouble goodwill, patience, political will to successfully advance towards the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This, in turn, will result in a new stability for the region and the world at large, on the understanding that peace in one country is an investment in global peace. For indeed, we all bound together by a common humanity and shared destiny for all. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for his statement. I give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Côte d'Ivoire.
Mr. President, Côte d'Ivoire would like to hail the American presidency of the Security Council for organizing this public meeting on non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The topic of today's debate is particularly relevant as it is taking place in a context that has been characterized by recurrent violations of international treaties and the resolutions of the Security Council aimed at banning the production, stockpiling, transfer, and the use of weapons of mass destruction. As a state party to all the treaties banning nuclear, chemical, and bacteriological weapons, Côte d'Ivoire shares the concerns of the international community in the face of the worrisome erosion of the non-proliferation regime and the serious threats that it represents for international peace and security. Mr. President, persistent security tensions on the Korean Peninsula, driven by the nuclear ambitions of North Korea, and the reports on the violations of the sanctions regime imposed by the Security Council are symbolic of the threats that the proliferation of WMDs represents. On this point, Côte d'Ivoire would like to urge North Korea to comply with its obligations incumbent on it in accordance with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. We encourage the North Korean authorities to take all necessary measures aimed at the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We commend the recent measures taken by Pyongyang, and the most important one to date has been the dismantlement. The most important one to date has been the dismantlement of its main nuclear test site in Pyongyang. We would urge the authorities to do even more to create an environment of reciprocal trust with all states of the region, as well as all the stakeholders pertaining to the North Korean nuclear issue. My country also welcomes the measures of détente, which have made it possible to return the remains of American soldiers who died during the war between 1950 and 1953, as well as the holding of this historic summit on the 12th of June of this year between Presidents Trump and Kim Jong-un. Mr. President, peace and lasting stability on the Korean Peninsula will only be possible through the commitment of all the states of the region to prefer dialogue and peaceful resolution of disputes. On this point, my country considers that the stakeholders should strengthen their relations of trust. And on this point, we note with satisfaction the improvement of the relations between the Koreas, which has been translated into the third summit in 1 year between Presidents Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un, which was held in Pyongyang between the 18th and the 20th of September. This summit is another step forward towards reconciliation between the two Koreas and the achievement of a zone of permanent peace. This meeting consolidated the foundations of Panmunjom Declaration of the 27th of April, as well as the achievements of the two previous summits, in particular the easing of political and military tensions and inter-Korean cooperation on denuclearization. Côte d'Ivoire also welcomes the determination of Korean leaders to engage in mutually beneficial cooperation on the economic and humanitarian spheres. We would like to pay tribute to the sponsors of this progress, in particular the United States and China. I would like to express the wish that the momentum of détente underway leads to the signature of a treaty of peace and denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. The Security Council is duty-bound to support and accompany the process of normalization underway. It should be firm regarding the implementation of the sanctions regime and its unity of action. It should be united in promoting respect for international treaties. Mr. President, Côte d'Ivoire would like to reiterate its conviction that only a collective engagement by our Council to support dialogue among the parties is the only way of achieving a resolution of the current crisis on the Korean Peninsula. We also would like to reaffirm our attachment to the virtues of multilateralism and would like to call on the strengthening of international frameworks where solutions to current challenges are being developed. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for his statement. I give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Peru.
Mr. President, we'd like to welcome your convening of this meeting in order to highlight the importance of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula in this Council. We'd also like to thank you for the important information provided and pass on to you the support of Peru in the significant efforts being deployed by your government. My country is extremely concerned at the serious threat to international peace and security represented by the nuclear and ballistic missile programs of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. As has been stated, this threat is a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter, the nuclear non-proliferation regime, and specific mandates of this Council. And here we would stress that the North Korean programs and their related activities must be abandoned in a complete, verifiable, and irreversible manner. And we believe that until such time as this has not occurred, the sanctions imposed by this Council must remain in force and be strictly implemented by all states. Peru is implementing these sanctions within its own jurisdiction, and we believe that this Council must be prepared to determine and sanction any possible lack of observance of these sanctions wherever this occurs. We'd like to stress the unanimous commitment of the members of the Security Council with regard to this issue. Peru attaches the greatest importance to maintaining this unity with a view to bringing about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And we would like to welcome the high-level diplomacy deployed by the South Korean and U.S. authorities, including yourself, Secretary of State, and we hope that this can begin to produce specific results in the area of denuclearization. Clearly, this is a complex issue which goes back to the Korean War, and that is why we appreciate the progress made in recent months, which has helped to alleviate tensions, promote trust, and reduce the risk of misunderstandings and miscalculations, and once and for all, it has laid basis for denuclearization. We welcome the agreements that were achieved at the third inter-Korean summit that was held last week, which contained specific measures aimed towards denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and reflect the intention of both countries to create a new situation of trust with a view to achieving peace. In the light of these developments, we believe that the sanctions imposed by this Council have shown that they are an effective method of bringing the North Korean government to the negotiating table without this leading to a worsening of the humanitarian situation for the North Korean civilian population. In this regard, we'd like to recognize the U.S. initiative, and under your leadership, the sanctions regime has been strengthened. And once again, we'd like to highlight the importance of multilateralism, of international law, and of the principle of peaceful settlement of disputes in order to address the threats and challenges which we all face. Mr. President, Peru, a country that is committed to the nuclear non-proliferation regime, is a party to all international instruments in this area. This includes the Treaty of Tlatelolco, thanks to which Latin America and the Caribbean are a region free of nuclear weapons, and the most recent treaty of the United Nations on the prohibition of these weapons. We hope for a world that will be free of the threat that these weapons represent, and I'd like to conclude by reaffirming the full and ongoing preparedness of Peru to assist in all efforts that are being deployed in order to bring about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister for his statement. I give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Equatorial Guinea.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by thanking Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and his government for having convened this open debate, and we'd like to congratulate the United States for its excellent work as President of the Security Council during this month of September. Mr. President, the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and global nuclear disarmament is one of the main principles and goals of the United Nations and of Equatorial Guinea. With this in mind, my government has maintained a firm policy of rejection and strongly condemning any action pertaining to the launch of ballistic missiles, conducting nuclear tests, development of a military nuclear program, as we consider these violations of the relevant resolutions of the Security Council of the United Nations that bolster international sanctions against the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Mr. President, the nuclear and ballistic missile programs of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is not simply a concern for the region, but rather it's a global concern, because the consequences and the effect of any nuclear explosion, whether it's accidental or intentional, would be disastrous on the global level. Equatorial Guinea has always considered that sanctions for the sake of sanctions are not the goal, but rather they are a means to an end. This is why they should be implemented with proportionality and caution, and based on the premise that first all other means have been exhausted, and also they should be implemented in such a way as that they should avoid damage to the weakest and most vulnerable groups. It should be clear that once they're imposed by this council, they should be an obligation to comply with for all states. However, we cannot assume that the current sanctions mechanism of the Sanctions Committee of the Security Council, established pursuant to Resolution 1718 in 2006, we cannot assume that it's the most effective mechanism. Equatorial Guinea is in favor of improving this mechanism by establishing stricter criteria for verification of evidence and strengthening the regime of nuclear non-proliferation through cooperation and international consultations. It should serve as a deterrent to maintain the moratorium on nuclear tests, and it should explicitly establish time limits regarding the sanctions adopted by the committee. It's also important to elaborate a protocol for the behavior by members of the committee, as well as taking practical and effective steps to disseminate and publicize universally the sanctions regime of 1718 pertaining to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It's also important to make sure that sanctions do not cause a humanitarian impact and hurt third countries. And it's important to help developing countries to strengthen their capacity to implement and comply with sanctions. Mr. President, we're witnessing rare opportunities and extreme challenges to achieve lasting peace and development for humankind. An example of this is the achieving peace and the complete and verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which continue to be one of the main topics on the agenda of the Security Council. The latest events of that have occurred this year in 2018 regarding the Korean Peninsula give us reasons for hope. I'm talking about the high-level negotiations between the leaders of the DPRK, Kim Jong-un, and the president of the Republic of Korea, Moon Jae-in, and the meetings that took place prior to that during the summit in June took place in Singapore between the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the leader of the DPRK. Now, if these meetings deliver results, they would lead to profound changes, very promising changes for the international community. And here we would like to highlight the leadership of the three statesmen that have put the superior interests of their people and their humankind ahead of their ideological convictions. We have before us a unique opportunity, and we should not lose this opportunity to try to achieve the pacification and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The recent summit on the 19th of September in Pyongyang between Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in gives us hope. The agreements achieved during that summit are a display of determination to continue with the rapprochement and friendly relations in seeking peace and understanding. The intention of presenting a joint candidature to host and organize the Olympic Games in 2032 is, I think, a step in the right direction. Equatorial Guinea can only encourage and praise the two brethren countries to continue with these efforts and trying to achieve an understanding with the goal of signing a peace agreement. We would also urge the two countries to continue promoting meetings and contacts between families separated by war. This is the right step to take. Proof of that is the emotional and moving meeting that took place between families last August. Lastly, Mr. President, Equatorial Guinea would also like to urge the countries that are in any way involved in the crisis on the Korean Peninsula, including those with influence in the region and the international community, to refrain from any action that could undermine the promising negotiations. And they should do quite the contrary, do everything possible to contribute to achieving a satisfactory solution for all, and to avoid a situation where there are winners and losers. And we would request the authorities of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to comply with the resolutions of the Security Council, to achieve the complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement of its nuclear and ballistic program, and to make sure that this dismantlement is a success and a milestone in history. Equatorial Guinea is ready to provide its small contribution in finding a definitive solution by offering our territory with excellent facilities as a neutral site for a possible future meeting among all the parties involved in the crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister for his statement. I give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, dear colleagues, I'm sure you remember vividly when world leaders gathered here in New York for the General Assembly 1 year ago. The tensions on the Korean Peninsula were alarmingly high and dangerous. And since then, positive historic progress has been made, and we have now a new momentum. But substantial challenges remain, and as much as we would like it, ignore simple process, and it will take time. Unity of this Council has been decisive for the progress made so far, and continued unity will be critical. And your participation on the Korean Peninsula, adopting numerous substantial resolutions by consensus. Sweden has contributed to these efforts, including by consistently pushing for diplomatic solutions. Our resolve must now be geared towards making further progress with a two-pronged approach. Firstly, we need to effectively implement the existing sanctions until the demands of this Council are met. And there are widespread violations of the sanctions regime in a range of areas, including arms exports, petroleum trade, and financial transactions. We call on all member states to fulfill their obligations and ensure full implementation. There is no doubt that the responsibility for the dire humanitarian situation in the DPRK fundamentally rests with the government. At the same time, there are concerns about indirect negative impact of sanctions. Enhanced efforts are therefore needed to ensure that the humanitarian exemptions are safeguarded. A generation of North Koreans must not be lost due to malnutrition and lack of medicines. Secondly, we must continue to encourage and support diplomatic efforts. Progress in the inter-Korean dialogue is very encouraging. Important agreements, including most recently in the summit in Pyongyang last week, have been achieved. And the summit between the United States and the DPRK in Singapore in June was indeed significant. All parties must now work to maintain momentum and build trust and confidence. A step-by-step approach is needed to achieve complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. For the DPRK, this means translating its commitments into concrete undertakings without delay. And it is important that the IAEA is given a role early in the process. Creative diplomacy will continue to be critical, and the parties should explore ways to move from the armistice towards a peace agreement. The need for regional collaborative arrangements, including on security, as we've heard others say here, is evident. An international framework that deals with all different aspects and that can contribute to sustainability is essential. We welcome the support of the UN Secretary General and the UN system. My country, with its presence in Pyongyang and as a long-standing member of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, the NNSC, will continue to assist diplomatic efforts. So, Mr. President, the situation on the Korean Peninsula has far-reaching implications for international peace and security. It is also vital for good neighborly relations in Northeast Asia. Recent progress has shown that it is possible to diffuse tensions through dialogue and cooperation, and this should be recognized by the Security Council, and the newfound opportunity should be seized. We must now work together and stay united towards a peaceful, prosperous, and nuclear weapons-free Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Bolivia.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. As President Morales stated yesterday, the issue relating to nuclear weapons and their proliferation is one of the most relevant items on the Council's agenda, and very important for my country. Bolivia is part of the first densely populated region of the world to declare itself 50 years ago nuclear weapons free through the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Bolivia has also included in its constitution the prohibition of the manufacture and use of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons on Bolivian territory, as well as the sequestration, transit, and depositing of nuclear byproducts or toxic waste. And we are signatories to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and that's why we call upon all states that have not yet done so, in particular the so-called nuclear states, to sign on to this important treaty, given that the best way to fight against weapons of mass destruction is to guarantee their full prohibition by all state actors as well as non-state actors. Mr. President, the People's Republic of Korea to stop and dismantle its program for developing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, with the ultimate aim of bringing about complete and verifiable and irreversible denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula. In 2017, we saw one of the most intense years in the Security Council with regard to the issue of non-proliferation in the DPRK. Following the nuclear test in September of this year and the multiple ballistic missile tests, the Security Council, thanks to its unity, adopted 3 resolutions which not only imposed ever harsher sanctions on this country, but also indicated the importance of peaceful solutions to the conflict on the Korean peninsula. We feel that the imposition of sanctions is meeting part of its objectives in terms of creating opportunities to bringing the parties around the negotiating table in order to resume dialogue to bring about a peaceful, diplomatic and political solution that will lead to the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. Bolivia reiterates its commitment to implement these resolutions and all resolutions emanating from this organ. Since this began in 2018, and thanks to the political willingness of the various parties involved, the situation on the Korean peninsula has seen positive changes. Bolivia, as a pacifist state, a state promoting the culture of dialogue and the peaceful settlement of disputes, welcomes the strengthening of the inter-Korean dialogue, which has seen 3 high-level meetings this year so far between Presidents Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. The result of these meetings, which laid the basis for a sincere dialogue based on mutual respect, were very significant. For example, the declaration of Panmunjom, which agrees to suspend all hostile acts between each other in all areas. This is a very important show of the willingness of the parties to build mutual trust and strengthen relations and search for peace and prosperity. We would have liked more specific results to have been achieved, such as an end to ballistic missile tests and the dismantling of the nuclear test sites in Pungri, and also led to those, and the meeting between families that were separated for more than 60 years because of the war. It was also agreed that the permanent dismantlement of the ballistic missile engine testing and launch site in Dongchang-ri, this was also agreed. And this made it possible for there to be a 4th meeting held in Seoul. If that is held, it will be a major event and show of mutual trust. We'd like to highlight the summit in Singapore between the DPRK and the US, between the presidents. This should help to build mutual trust between the parties with the ultimate aim of bringing about the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, building a system of lasting peace and stable peace. And the suspension of military activities between the 2 countries will help to contribute to this end. Sanctions should not be an aim in themselves, and we don't want them to have an adverse effect on the people of DPRK. Any action of this Council should take into account that we don't want to undermine the living conditions of the local population, and we stress the important work here that has been done by the committee established pursuant to Resolution 1718, providing exceptions for the import of products for humanitarian ends. And we also reject any action, unilateral action, or any kind of imposition of unilateral sanctions. Mr. President, finally, we'd highlight once again that there is no military solution to this conflict. Only a diplomatic solution based on dialogue and consultations will make it possible to bring about the complete and verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and make it possible to build an environment of sustainable peace in this region. Thank you.
I thank the representative for his statement. I give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, Secretary Pompeo, thank you very much for convening this meeting and the opportunity for me to speak to the Council. As you state, Mr. President, we are indeed at the dawn of a new day with regard to the challenge of North Korea's denuclearization. And it is useful to take a step back and to realize just how new. Barely a year ago, here in the Council, we were counting the numbers of North Korea's nuclear tests and ballistic missile launches, and calling for united action to bring North Korea to the right side of history. At the time, the thought of President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un shaking hands and holding a summit would have been considered a daydream. It would have been a fantasy to imagine President Moon Jae-in and Chairman Kim Jong-un on top of Mount Baekdu taking photos together. But here we are, and we have a different set of numbers to ponder. 3 inter-Korean summits and the first ever U.S.-North Korea summit in a matter of 5 months, with more likely to follow in the months to come. Mr. President, allow me to quickly cap the milestone developments on the Korean Peninsula that have brought us to this point. They started with North Korea's participation in the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games in February and March, to which the North Korean leaders sent a high-level delegation. And this was quickly followed by the visit of President Moon's special envoy to Pyongyang in early March, who came back with a first-hand confirmation of Chairman Kim's intentions on denuclearization. In April, North Korea took a step forward by announcing that it would discontinue nuclear tests as well as ballistic missile tests of intercontinental range. It also announced that it would dismantle its nuclear test site, which it did a month later. On the 27th of April, the two Koreas held an inter-Korean summit, the first in more than a decade. In the outcome, the Panmunjom Declaration, the two sides agreed to actively cooperate for the establishment of a permanent and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, and confirmed the common goal of realizing a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula through complete denuclearization. And at the first ever U.S.-North Korea summit on the 12th of June, the top leaders of the two countries also confirmed the common goal of building a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. And the North Korean leader reaffirmed his commitment to complete denuclearization. And last week, President Moon visited Pyongyang for his third summit meeting with Chairman Kim. They discussed at length the denuclearization challenge, including concrete ways to bring it about. And for the first time, in his own voice, the North Korean leader stated his commitment to turn the Korean Peninsula into a land of peace, free of nuclear weapons and threat. And this at a joint press conference with President Moon, which was broadcast live to the rest of the world. More specifically, in the Pyongyang Joint Declaration, North Korea announced that it will permanently dismantle its Dongchangli missile engine test site and launch platform under the observation of experts from relevant countries, and indicated its willingness to take additional measures, such as the permanent dismantlement of the nuclear facilities at Yongbyon, as the United States takes corresponding measures. And now, hopes are high that the upcoming U.S.-North Korea negotiations will produce more concrete outcomes. Mr. President, the international community has been able to bring North Korea back to the dialogue through a well-measured combination of diplomatic tools. In particular, the Security Council played a critical role. The Council unanimously adopted a series of sanctions in response to North Korea's nuclear and missile provocations, and the international community acted with unity in fully implementing them, sending a clear message to North Korea that its pursuit of nuclear weapons program will never be accepted. But at the same time, the door for dialogue was kept open to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table. And eventually, the will of the international community has prevailed, and North Korea changed course and came to the path of dialogue and peaceful resolution. In the last few months, it has taken a series of, for the first time, actions that were unthinkable only a year ago. As for the government of the Republic of Korea, we are committed to continuing to work with the international community to ensure that the Council's sanctions are faithfully implemented, even as we continue to engage North Korea to facilitate substantial progress towards complete denuclearization. We're also furthering inter-Korean dialogue to solidify the momentum for reconciliation and better relations. And this includes implementing the comprehensive military agreement signed in Pyongyang, which aims to eliminate the threat of war and prevent accidental clashes. Mr. President, last week, while in North Korea, many of us joined President Moon and Chairman Kim on their visit to Mount Baekdu. And as the highest point on the Korean Peninsula, this mountain bears a very special meaning for all Koreans. The microclimate of Mount Baekdu makes the weather very unpredictable. Sunny and clear one moment, but foggy and drizzly the next. We were there in stunningly clear and sunny weather, but that was probably the exception than the norm. Our path to complete denuclearization and the establishment of a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula might prove likewise uneasy periods of uncertainty and wariness, interspersed by moments of a step change in progress and clear visibility toward our goal. But in the longer scheme of things, comparing where we were a year ago and where we are today, the situation has definitively become more clear and visibility has been greatly enhanced. The change has been possible because of bold, far-sighted, and determined leadership, much of which has rested in you, Mr. Pompeo, and enhanced and the unity of the international community. And as long as we stay this course, I am confident that the months ahead will take us even closer to our shared goal of realizing a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula that is permanently at peace. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister for her statement. I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would first like to extend my sincere gratitude to Secretary Pompeo for your tireless efforts on North Korean issues. You have not only brought this meeting together to reaffirm our collective determination to tackle these pressing issues, but you have also been selflessly dedicated to achieving the complete denuclearization of North Korea for the good of us all. I would also like to pay tribute to my counterpart from the Republic of Korea, Minister Khan, for her leadership and hard work. Japan welcomes and supports the ongoing diplomatic efforts, including the historic U.S.-North Korea summit in Singapore in June, as well as 3 inter-Korean summits this year, as a step towards the comprehensive resolution of the outstanding issues regarding North Korea. It is my greatest hope that these efforts will lead to the complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement of all weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missiles of all ranges by North Korea, which is a common goal that we all share under the relevant Security Council resolution. Japan will spare no effort to realize this goal. Nevertheless, We are acutely aware that the IAEA's most recent report expressed grave concern that North Korea continues its nuclear program. What we seek is for North Korea to seize this unprecedented opportunity and take decisive and irreversible steps towards CVID. The international community should come together to assist the diplomatic efforts that are underway and encourage North Korea to make a strategic decision to fulfill its international obligations and commitments. In doing so, it is critical for us to remain united to ensure full implementation of the resolutions that this Council has unanimously adopted. I am convinced that there is no better way for us to support the current diplomatic process. We should also be aware of some important incidents. The government of Japan shares the view of the United States government and some other partner countries that the 2018 annual cap for petroleum products has already been breached. It is important that all member states immediately stop supplying these products to North Korea under the Security Council resolutions. There are also continued reports of increasingly sophisticated efforts to evade and circumvent measures based on the Security Council resolutions, including through so-called ships-to-ship transfers and the selling of fishing rights. The very authority of the decisions made by this Council is at stake. It is our obligation to